Okay, so yeah. Hello and welcome to this talk on React Native. Since it's a crash course talk, this is going to be a little bit high level and not too in depth, but I do have an example. I do have example code at the end. Oh yeah, I should introduce myself first. I'm Arlene. I'm a sophomore here at Carnegie Mellon studying statistics and machine learning, and I actually lead a project group within ScottyLabs, where we're currently using React Native. So hence, I'm giving this presentation. Before I get started, this talk kind of assumes that you have some basic background in programming. So this kind of assumes basic knowledge in like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, as we won't be like going like that low level. But for this, as the name implies, React Native, it is something based heavily on React. So this talk assumes no knowledge of React, but you should have some basic knowledge about like JavaScript, the language that React is in. Right. Now, an outline of what we're going to be going over today. First, I'm going to give a very brief high level of what is React Native. Then I'm going to go over some React Native basics. And then I'm going to walk through a very quick note-taking app that I built. So first things first, what is React Native? For those of you who don't know, React Native is a cross-platform mobile app development framework. Breaking this down, React Native is for writing mobile apps. So anything that you use on your phone can be built using React Native. It's a framework, which means that it's like a library, like a foundation, allowing developers to build on it. And it's a cross-platform, which means that you can write this code once in JavaScript, and it can be deployed onto both Android and iOS platforms. So you have to write the code once for it to be used. So you don't have to write two different versions in like Java and Swift, like you would for Android and iOS apps normally. But this allows web developers who are used to using JavaScript to transition to mobile app development really easily without having to learn how to write new languages. And yeah, as the second bullet point. So this is specifically for developers who are fluent in React to be able to basically with no foundation and only like having to search for only having to learn React Native specific components, they can start developing mobile apps on their own right away. So I'm going to talk briefly about how to set up and get started with installation. So React, you would need everything that you typically need for React. So that includes like installing Node and React Native. Well, okay, this is not React specific, but this also includes installing React Native CLI. It's also a good idea to have Xcode and Android Studio open because this allows for ease of setting up your emulators that you'll be viewing your React Native apps on. This is a distinguishment between React and React Native. For those of you familiar with React, normally you just have to run like yarn start or whatever, and it shows up on your browser directly, but you need like a bit of additional infrastructure because you can't view React Native apps in like the browser, but you can only view them in like emulators or like if you connect a device to your computer. And within the React Native community, there have been tools such as Expo and Create React Native App that have been developed to make it really easy to start writing your own project. The difference between these two, so Expo is sort of more beginner friendly tool. So it has a more limited set of like components available for use, but it's like built in a more structured user friendly way. Then Create React Native App is to help you start your app, make your app really easily, but there's no like nice guidance that Expo has. Instead, it does allow you the full flexibility of using any React Native component that you want. Before I move on, are there any questions right now? Okay, continuing on. Once you install React Native and create your first React Native project, the general project structure that you'll see is a folder called node modules, and this just stores, most of the time you don't have to worry about it because this just stores all of the React Native framework tools you'll be using. There's Index.js, which is the entry point of the entire project when you run your project. There's App.js, which is the entry point for the actual code structure of your project. So when React Native is building what you're going to see on the screen, app.js is the first file it looks to. The iOS folder contains iOS related code. So if you want your iOS and Android apps to differ slightly in terms of appearance, the iOS folder, like you can write Swift code in it and it'll show up on like the iOS version only. And the same thing for Android, but for Android devices. And then most of your code that you'll be writing, it will be in .js files that you will create, you'll create and usually like group into your own folder. And then this is where you'll store your code for your custom written components. And it usually starts with like import statements of whatever you need, then your actual component code, and then exports. So I think this is a good time right now to talk about something that makes React super popular, which is I'm going to backtrack a little. There's like two main things that make React super popular. First of all, it's the fact that React has very fast refresh, meaning that like in traditional web pages and like phone screens, reloading the page is kind of slow because every time there's a change, the computer normally reloads the entire page, but React makes it so that way they have an intermediate step that makes it so that way whenever there's a change detected in like what they're supposed to display, it only re-renders that small part of the screen. So it's like much faster and seamless in terms of like page transition. And then the second thing is the reusability of it. Traditional like HTML, CSS, JavaScript for building web browsers requires a lot of, because HTML is purely for the structure of the web page, you have to write a bunch of code for the HTML page, and then JavaScript is purely for the interactivity. Whereas in React and React Native, it combines HTML and JavaScript together to make it so that way you kind of write in like a hybrid of the two languages. And this allows for making the structure of your app as well as like in handling the interactivity really convenient. And this kind of builds up to one of React's base principles, which is components. And components are like you can write and make your own custom component, which is like you could group a text box and an image together, for example, and have that instead of like rewriting that for like every instance you want to use it, you just have to write it once and you can reuse it easily. So this is like the beauty of React in that in its high reusability. Once you write a component, you can use it easily in other places. And this typical JavaScript file structure, the import statements are like importing any other components you would be using. And then the component code is like the custom thing you're building. And then once you export it, that makes it usable for other parts of your project, which you would like import from those files. And you'll see an example of it later on in the note-taking app I'm going to be going over. Love you, Nishka. Okay, yeah. Now I'm going to go over some more like lower level code specific stuff about React. So the first, I think, most important function is render. Every component will have a render function, and this is where you place the like HTML like code to structure your component. And as with like HTML, you specify the components you want to put in using tags. And again, you'll see a couple more examples of that later on. And There is a parent-child relationship between the custom components you write, which are the parent, and any components that you end up using to render in your render function. They're considered like the child of that component. And components can be divided into two types, functional and class. So functional components are stateless, meaning that once you render them, they can't change. And they're usually purely used for UI or display purposes. So if you wanted to have, I don't know, something really fancy, just like show up permanently on your screen without like the ability for the user to interact or change it, you would use a functional component. The advantage to these components is that they're really quick to whip up and write, because the other type class components require a lot more code. But like, as I said, there's no interactivity allowed with this. And then class components are the ones that you would use for handling interactivity. So like if you want to store some like pieces of information or do anything complex like load data from, I don't know, an API, then this would happen in a class component. There's a lot more code you have to write in order to build a fully functional class component, but there's like a bigger degree of flexibility with it in that it allows you to handle interactivity. Then a little bit onto what else I was saying. Components usually have two other additional, I guess, like features to them, which are props and states. So every component, both functional and class components, have props, and these are like the permanent field properties about a component. And whereas state, only class components have them, and this allows them to have that interactivity to it because states are like editable features of a component, and they allow for the interactivity portion of that class components have. Good example I like to use for props and states is like if you were trying to make a component that was modeling a person, for example. A person, their birth date, for example, would be something that's a prop about them. It's a fact that can never change about someone, and like therefore it's a property of them. It's something permanent, but defines this component. Whereas a state could be their age, because every year your age changes by one number. So this is something that is something that defines a component, but but its value can change. And then I'm going to talk about, this won't be as relevant for the demo I'm going to show you, but I think it's still good to know. The React lifecycle, there's 3 states primarily. There's mounting, updating, and unmounting. So mounting is where you initialize everything in your app. So this includes like initializing all the components you'll need and rendering them, figuring out how to render them onto the screen. And then updating is when whatever components are currently running in your app are currently in use. This is where like your states are changing. So if you had like a text input thing, as you'll see, and it's actively in use and changing, this is part of the updating. So this is like the lifetime of a component. And then unmounting is when you no longer use something. Say you navigate from one page to another, and this means that like the previous page of components is no longer needed. So this is where everything is like erased basically and like tossed because you're no longer actively interacting with it. And then some other React Native features I want to is I talked about how HTML and JavaScript are used primarily, but there's also CSS, which is styling. And in React/React Native, CSS is largely the same. You can either include it within your file, or you can like make it you can write it as a separate file, and then you kind of modify it much the same way you would HTML code with the traditional HTML CSS relationship / syntax. And then If you want to make your app more complicated and do like make API/endpoint requests, if you want to have it back into your app, basically, or in the previous slide, the mounting and unmounting stages, as you can see, there's a component did mount, component will unmount. And these are just like methods that will like load the data for you or like erase everything for you. And you would typically include your like backend interaction code in these functions. And then bootstrapping to develop platform-specific versions. There are other convenient tools that, like, if you want to add features that are iOS only or Android only, and React also has tools that will allow you to do this with ease. Yeah, a little bit more on CSS/styling. If you want to use it, you would import your CSS files into your component files, and then you would just like specify the properties you're using, the properties you're modifying within part of the component tag within the render function that would match like what you call the property in your CSS file. And here are some React Native resources that I think are really good. The first one has a really good and informative setup of like how to initialize and like set up your environment to be able to support React Native properly. It's kind of complicated, but I think this site has really good specific directions for like every operating system. And I think a good like React Native tutorial about like building an app can be found at the second link. And I'm gonna transition to my computer. I'm gonna transition to like my editor and showing you guys now like the example app, and I'm gonna walk through it to show you guys some more specific examples. But before that, like high level content wise, is there any questions? Okay, I am going to very quickly share a different part of my screen. I believe in response to Aditi's question, I can paste my email in the chat if you want, but I think that if you want like our like more direct contact information, I would ask the crash course organizers for it. But if you're part of ScottyLabs, always like feel free to DM me. Yeah, thanks, Steph. Okay, and then I'm going to show you guys now. Here is my editor, and I made a very simple note-taking app that doesn't have any styling to it because I forgot about styling my app. And then this project has like three files that I wrote, and I'll just go over them and then I'll show you their display. So within a project, as I was talking about the project structure, there's an Android folder, an iOS folder, node modules folder, Index.js, which is the entry point of the entire like the whole project, and then App.js, which is the entry point for like the code. And a lot of the stuff is, so I initialized this app by running like React Native init and then whatever I wanted to call my app name. And a lot of the stuff in app.js is still like the default stuff that comes with the file, but I want to point you to this part. This part is the only part that matters. In here, what I just made a simple title for my app, and then I also I imported a custom component I wrote called Note Screen, and I'm just using it and displaying it within my component. So this is an example of a functional component. I should have mentioned this early, but functional components, they don't specifically have a render function, but the entire body of the function is the render function itself. So you can think of it as being embedded within the functional component directly. So in this return statement, I'm just using like HTML syntax to display a custom component I wrote. Then within Note Screen, this is a class component. So as you can see, I'm importing what I need to, and then within my class component, so the only feature my note-taking app has is that you can enter text. So within this, I have, because the text is something that is constantly changing about the component, this is something that I have a state for, because this is an interactive part of this component. And so I initialize it first as like something empty, and then I write a function to handle the changes, and I update my state every time I detect a change within the text, and just basically set the state to that. Then I also decided to include a button. This is just code that handles the button, and this is a new button. And for this button, all I do is like reset the text input. So as you can see, I update the state to be empty, an empty string. And then here is my render function where all the display is happening. First, I extract my notes value from the state within my component, and then I am using the built-in React Native component text input to display it and like take in the text. And this is an example of how you would actively use and define the props of the child components you're using. So over here, these are the prop names for the text input component, and I'm just specifying the values. So the value that the text input is going to show is like whatever notes text that I am writing, and then on change text, like every time there's a change detected in the input, the function that I defined earlier, I'm passing that in. And then placeholder should be kind of explanatory. And then new button display is another component that I wrote, but there's no, as you'll see in a bit, it's a functional component because there's no interactivity with it. It's just like rendering a button. And on press is a props that I defined for this, and I'm just passing in my state handling thing for this. And then at the bottom, I'm exporting this, so that way this line of code is what makes it usable in App.js. And then finally, within my new button display, this is where the functional component is, just for like rendering the button. As you can see, it's kind of like a wrapper around the built-in button component for React Native. And again, this is a functional component, so I don't need to like explicitly make the header render, but all I'm doing here is using button as a child component, and I'm specifying the like the CSS styling a little bit of what I did here. And then the other props required for a button, using the button as the child component, I pass in based on like elements that I defined. And then again, this export statement makes it usable in Note Screen. So after going over the basic code structure of this very simple app, here is my emulator that has everything. And as you can see, I didn't do styling, so everything is kind of squished together. But yeah, you can barely make it out, but the no app title, this is what I rendered in App.js, like within the text wrapper, and then within the text wrapper here. And then here's my note screen component, which has a text input and the placeholder, as you can see, write your notes here. And then this new button is new button display, and within this it has it's the text that it has is showing up here. So now if I want to type okay, so I can interact with it, and then if I press new, it resets the state to be empty. So this is a very simple app. Are there any questions about like code specifics maybe, or like places you want me to revisit or explain more about? Because otherwise, how do we store state? Can you clarify a bit more? Like the state is, as I've shown you, like, okay, so yeah, answering the question, how do we store states? As I've shown you, the state is, once you initialize the state, if you ever want to update the value of the state, which it will automatically like store for that component, you would use this .set state. And then, okay, yeah, so I'll go over that part again. As I said, this .set state is like where you would like change and update your state values. And then if you want to, when you want extract it to display, as you can see here, this line of code is extracting the notes value from the state, and the value that I'm placing in for text input is like where you display this. As for, so I'm not using any VS Code extension for React. This is, you would have to follow a React tutorial to set up the relevant like libraries you need, and like installing Node, for example, is something that you would need. So once you do that, like VS Code doesn't have like any particular extensions that support this. Answering the second question. Are there other questions? And this like very simple example app is something that I will be uploading into a GitHub repository, and I'll have the crash course organizers share the links if you want to take a look at it later. Okay, if that's it, this might have been a slightly shorter talk, but I hope everybody learned something from this, and yeah, thank you for coming for this / staying from the previous one. Yeah, that is, having some backend in the display is cool, but it does require a lot more complicated setup, and not, before adding, I was not sure if it was in the scope of a crash course talk, because there's a lot more setup you have to do, and like coding to make it accessible for it. What do you mean about a reason that I chose? Oh, React versus Flutter. See, Flutter uses Dart, and React is like something that's becoming more popular these days. It's like, it's pretty widely used in industry because of like its fast refresh, like the seamlessness, and like the component reusability. So React Native was built on top of that, because since React is only for web browsers, React Native was built on top of that to extend to mobile platforms. So it's a lot of web developers looking to like develop mobile apps would choose React Native, and React Native has better, in my opinion, over Flutter. React Native has better integration across, like for the cross platforms. It's kind of like buggy and like chunky sometimes for other cross-platform frameworks. So I prefer it over Flutter just because of A, familiarity with React, and B, it just has better integration for deploying across the system, across operating systems. Okay, I think that's the last talk of the day as well, right? So